Yes.
Before I move on from sickle cell care, I've just been asked to ask you a question. Very few sickle cell and indeed thalassemia patients have given statements to the inquiry. Is there anything you can draw on from your experience treating patients with haemoglobinopathies to explain this?
Well, it may well be that my experience is mirrored across the country, that very few did acquire transfusion-related infections. I don't think they will have been undertaking other activities that could have given them those infections, particularly because of all their other problems. So I can only work on that assumption, I think.
Might stigma have also played a role in a hesitance to engage?
It might. I mean, as we sat over coffee, I reflected on another story. I remember one of my patients standing up and saying, "It's good that you're our doctor because you understand what it's like to be a second-class citizen." And when I inquired in what way, he said, "Well, you're a woman." So clearly there was perceived stigma.
I want to move on then from sickle cell care.
Well, just before you do, are you aware of any physiological reason why someone from the communities who suffer principally from sickle cell and thalassemia should not be affected in the same way as those who don't come from those communities?
No. I mean, the sickle patients, SS and S beta 0, SD, lose their splenic function. That makes them more at risk of bacterial infection, but that's quite a different matter.
Because I wanted, again, if I can just say this to those who are listening, to be clearly understood that it's entirely up to anyone to make their own decision as to whether they want to come forward and give evidence, either directly to us or through an intermediary. If they do, they are very welcome, and they ought not to be afraid if they are afraid, or worried if they are worried that in some way the inquiry is an official body. They are welcome. And I can just repeat my request to those who may feel moved to give evidence to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I want to move on then to your work with clinicians outside of sickle cell care. You, as a haematologist, also provided advice to clinicians elsewhere in the hospital outside of the haematology department. Is that right?
Yes, particularly when on call.
That would only be when those other clinicians sought your advice?
Generally when they sought our advice, but of course, as routine blood tests went through the laboratory, if they were abnormal, then they were usually flagged to the doctors, and sometimes we would just write a comment, but sometimes we would be moved to ring up or go and see the patient. And if anyone wanted platelets or blood products, they would need to ask for our agreement. And if anyone ordered abnormal amounts of blood, over routine, or there was a problem, a big massive hemorrhage in theatre or A&E, blood bank would be informed and they would probably tell us if we were around. So sometimes we were proactive.
And in terms of that proactivity, did that extend to a more educative role of clinicians outside of the haematology department about reducing the use of particularly red cell concentrates?
Yes. I was given to chuntering round the hospital, blood is a dangerous drug, every drug has side effects, don't use it unless you need it. And I was well known for going on about that at surgeons and people.
And were any audits carried out to assess the use of blood by other departments?
I think there were audits, but I don't recall them, and the world of audit has gone up steadily through the 90s and into this century, so I can't recall them.
You've spoken about the haematology department following the relevant guidelines that had been published. How would your colleagues, if at all, access those guidelines, say in obstetrics or anaesthetics?
They were flagged up to them, so I don't think they could reasonably claim they were not shown. But as you heard, the evidence is it's very difficult to change people's behaviours. And I have, through my R&D role, understood that evidence is a social construct and people's attitudes matter as well in how they hear the evidence and whether they take action.
And you've said in your statement that you think there was a hospital transfusion committee.
There was.
But you didn't sit on it.
I think I did for a period, but I apart from knowing it was there and not knowing the date, of course, I don't remember the content. I also remember that someone from the Regional Transfusion Service came to it.
Do you recall which other specialties were on the committee?
No.
And in terms of the role of that committee in promulgating or disseminating guidelines to other specialties and saying, look, there's a new guideline on platelet usage or red cell concentrates, what role did the committee play in that regard?
So I think the committee must have played a role, but I would be wrong to say it did because my memory doesn't recall. I'm sorry.
In terms of the use of red cell concentrates in non-sickle contexts, you've said in your statement that you advised other clinicians that transfusion was contraindicated if the haemoglobin was over 10. Was that the level, the rule of thumb that you used throughout your practice?
But for the non-sickle cell patients, it was the rule of thumb. That didn't mean that if it was 8, that you needed a transfusion. It depends on why you're anemic and how long you've been anemic, because as you become anemic, a certain enzyme, I think it's 2,3-DPG, which is packaged with the haemoglobin, changes how much oxygen you can pick up and how you deliver it. So if you are anemic over a period of time, it's like going high altitude. Over time, you become accustomed because you alter this enzyme. So first of all, how long's it been there? Then, is there a way you can treat it, particularly with iron and other hematinics, that will sort it?
Could we turn to RLIT 301564, please? This is a copy of the ABC of Transfusion edited by Marcela Contreras with a chapter in it that you wrote. This is from 1990. If we could then turn on to page 16, please. We pick up your chapter on transfusion of red cells. And it starts in this way. The term blood transfusion is often used rather loosely by doctors when what they really mean is the transfusion of red cells. Symptomatic of this linguistic laxity is that blood is often transfused without sufficient regard either to the specific requirements of the patient or to the potentially harmful effects of the transfusion. Was that your experience at the Central Middlesex at around this time?
I think in Central Middlesex, Misha Brozovic had been there for some years and had been educating people, and I came and added more energy and newness to it. They were rarely misused, if at all, but I think there was still misuse across the country, so I stand by this at that time.
And then if we turn the page, please, we pick up under the heading indications for transfusion of red cells. And the chapter says this: the only true indication for the transfusion of red cells is the need to improve the delivery of oxygen to the tissues within a short time. A low haemoglobin concentration should not be the only reason for transfusion, as many other factors are important. These include the patient's age and general state and the rate of fall of the haemoglobin concentration. A patient whose haemoglobin concentration falls suddenly feels ill and may well require transfusion. An equally low haemoglobin concentration, for example 80 grams per litre, may be well tolerated by a patient whose body has had time to adapt because the fall has taken place gradually over weeks or months. So such patients are generally better treated in other ways. And if we turn the page, please, to pick up the preoperative blood transfusion situation, where it says it's usually safer to correct anemia with appropriate hematinics if its cause is known. If preoperative anemia cannot be corrected in this way, for example, if the operation is an emergency or the patient has failed to respond to hematinics and the haemoglobin concentration is 80 grams per litre or less, the patient may be transfused. When the haemoglobin concentration is between 80 and 100 grams per litre, each patient should be assessed individually before the decision to transfuse is made. Here, a haemoglobin of 80 is given, 8 or less rather than 10 or less. When do you think that change came into play?
It must have come into play in the 80s, mustn't it?
And does that accord with what you were advising clinicians at the time?
Yes.
When you advised clinicians about particularly preoperative or post-operative transfusion needs and the shift from the 10, haemoglobin of a 10 to haemoglobin of 8, was that advice generally followed by your clinical colleagues, or did you face resistance to it?
The anaesthetists found it difficult and worrying, but I mean, we steadily moved. So I wouldn't say anyone was resistant, just, it took time. Change always takes time in the NHS.
And you've mentioned the anaesthetists being particularly worried. Were there other specialties where you tended to find that they found it more difficult?
Well, the orthopaedic surgeons found change difficult, but and we didn't have any of the other specialties like open heart surgery or major liver surgery or anything that might have different views, and I'm not expert at that, and I wasn't then either, so I can't comment.
I want to then move on to your role when you were Chief Medical Officer. We've spoken, but just so that we put it into context, you were appointed as interim CMO in 2010 and then CMO in 2011. What did the role of CMO entail?
It has many roles. You are there to advise ministers and policymakers on the issues of the time, to write an annual report, to be, as we called it, in inverted commas, the nation's doctor when there are emergencies or when there are big campaigns that need a medical face because it's a medical issue. So it has a number of roles in it together.
And when you talk about being the nation's doctor, what do you mean by that?
Well, if I went on the television or the radio, then I was the one who, as one of the most senior clinicians in the country, was speaking to the public on behalf of the medical profession rather than actually the government. I was independent. Our chief medical advisor and chief scientific advisor are independent.
Was there a formal job description for the CMO role?
There was. I have not brought it with me.
Perhaps it's something we can be provided with subsequently. In terms of oversight of blood transfusion services, what role did you play as CMO in that regard?
None at all.
And why was that?
Well, there'll be two reasons. The first, it did not come up as an issue while I was CMO. The second was, of course, that the Lansley reforms of 2011 separated the public health function and the Department of Health where I sat from the NHS, who had a senior medical director. So while I reserved the right to comment or act on or in the NHS, I generally focused on the public health and the cross-government role, and I did much more cross-government work than my predecessors had done. I argued that I was the chief medical officer for the whole of government, not the NHS.
But by cross-government, do you mean across all 4 nations or just cross-government so far as England was concerned?
Cross-government in Whitehall, I was the UK government's most senior medical advisor, but if it was something that strayed into, so Foreign Office, Home Office, it would be me, development. But, for instance, when I was asked by the then Prime Minister to update the guidelines on safe alcohol consumption, I asked the other CMOs to join in so that it was from all of us. When I felt we needed to update the guidelines on physical activity, I asked them to join with me so that it was all of us together. So I was the primus inter pares.
And in terms of guidelines and guidance, was it part of your role to provide guidance or guidelines for clinicians on a national basis about policies and practices?
No, it was not part of my role to write or prepare guidelines because those sit with experts. And of course, the one route is NICE, who not only bring in the experts, but the patients and consult. Another is the specialist societies who produce quite a lot of guidelines. So there are many routes for experts to input. And my expertise was sickle cell becoming out of date and of being able to integrate different areas and think about it. And of course, research strategy.
One of the themes of the evidence that the inquiry's heard has been about the difficulties of information and guidelines being disseminated to different clinicians. What role, if at all, does the CMO play in assisting that?
So I think my predecessor did it a bit differently. He wrote to all, there was a CMO letter to all doctors, not frequently, but more than once a year, and he would highlight a number of things. However, I did not do that. We were in a phase of government reducing the size of the civil service and therefore the amount of support. And it seemed to me that when I'd been on the receiving end, that getting too much from all sorts of places left you kind of wondering, so which has supremacy and when am I going to find time to read that and look after my patients? So I left the dissemination essentially to NICE their own guidelines and the specialists to them. But we all know you've got to have the experts write it, but it needs to be grounded in reality. I mean, I could write a guideline that no one could do, but it might be perfection. It needs to be grounded in reality. It then has to be disseminated. But the big problem is not dissemination. You can email it, you can post it, you can put it on a wall. But how do you change the hearts and minds so people do things differently? And it is extraordinarily difficult.
And what involvement as a CMO did you have in that aspect of changing hearts and minds?
I played a bit of a role in antimicrobial resistance because I chose that as one of the issues of my time. But essentially, that has to be the role of the NHS and their system. And I was not actually part of their system. They had a senior medical director who assured me that all was fine.
What was your view of the ethical principles underpinning the role of CMO as a civil servant answerable to the government, but also a public servant with particular responsibilities for the public's health, and also a doctor subject to the usual ethical and regulatory duties? What was your view of how all of that came together within the role of CMO?
quite simple. I have very strong moral values that were developed through a childhood where a father was a theologian, and I stick to them. They fit with the Nolan principles, and I told truth to power when I felt it was needed.
What, in your view, then, would be an ethical response for a CMO if they felt that the government or ministers were acting in a way that wasn't transparent or fully candid to the general public about an emerging or present public health crisis?
So, one example would be Ebola. And we had a debate between myself, the minister, and the communications people about, was Ebola going to reach England, and if it was, how are we going to handle it? But actually, should we warn the public? I did tell the public that I expected us to get up to a handful of imported cases, and we did.
You've talked in your statement about...
Just one moment. What was the counter-argument? What was the argument that you shouldn't?
I think it's a kind of paternalistic, don't worry the people, because it may not happen. Whereas the evidence, of course, about scientific communication is that you should be very straightforward, tell the truth, what you do know and what you don't know, and then update as you learn more. And that's where I come from.
Thank you.
That might suggest some tension between the role of advising ministers and the public, as you've put it in your statement, without fear. Is that fair, that there was some tension in those two roles?
Not often, and it was always resolved. I did what I thought was right.
And are you aware of whether there had been tensions in that regard between those two roles for previous CMOs?
I never discussed it.
To what extent do you think that CMO advice to ministers should be published for the public to see and understand?
Well, my main advice came through reports or me speaking very publicly. I think you have to recognise that the relationship to be effective is built on trust. Trust that I would tell them the truth, trust that I knew what I was telling them, and trust that I would help them get to the best answer. And as we see played out at the moment, advisors are there to advise, and the politicians at the end of the day have to decide. So there are discussions which don't need making public. It would not be helpful. It's about building trust and developing that relationship so that when the issue is difficult, they listen. And they did.
The counter to that might be that the public have a right, if there's health concerns and health consequences, to understand the debate and be aware of the advice that's being given.
I accept that, and there were a couple of occasions where I said, if you don't follow my advice, I will resign. The public would have known had they not listened.
And to what extent do you think other health-related special advisory committee advice should be public and published?
I think that the protocol for scientific advisory committees to government is quite clear. The minutes are published, and I expect them to be.
During your time as CMO, in your statement, you've spoken about 3 public health emergencies: the flu pandemic, Ebola, and the Novichok poisonings. What is the CMO's role in those sorts of situations?
So it's quite a pivotal role, because you sit understanding the science, because if you don't, you've got to get the right people in to make sure you do, knowing where the NHS is, and therefore reality of what can be done, and working with the politicians and across government. So in the 9-10 flu pandemic, it was wave 3. And I needed to review the data and see where it was going and try and help push the country into understanding the importance of the role of vaccination. And indeed, I was on holiday at the New Year and the levels went up alarmingly, and I came back from holiday to make sure I was there to advise both politicians and the nation going on television. So that was the role I played there. My predecessor in waves 1 and 2 played a more active role because that was when the pandemic was starting. In Ebola,
Just before we move to Ebola, can I just pick up one point that you've mentioned there? You talked about discussing with politicians. Who particularly would you be dealing with, and how much would you liaise with the Secretary of State for Health?
Secretary of State for Health regularly, more than weekly, often daily, Permanent Secretary and all the senior policy officials and the Minister for Public Health.
Thank you. If you can, you're very welcome to continue in relation to Ebola.
Ebola was different. I was kind of responsible in that same sort of way within the UK and England. I co-chaired the SAGE, Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, with the Chief Scientific Advisor. And as CMO, I go to the Cabinet Office briefing rooms, COBRA meetings, to give my opinion and views to the ministers, chaired often by the Prime Minister or others, and take into that, sitting alongside the Minister of Health, issues from Public Health England, Public Health, SAGE and the NHS to try and make sure we get to the right place. I also did a number of televised briefings to the nation. I played a role through that, working with the Minister without portfolio on, and the present Chief Medical Officer, who was the Chief Scientific Advisor for the Department for International Development, on advising how we responded as we took the lead for Ebola in Sierra Leone, and on pushing to make sure that the NHS had appropriate PPE, appropriate training, and things like that.
As CMO in an emerging pandemic, what role did you play to ensure that NHS clinicians have the relevant information and guidance that they need?
The NHS leadership dealt with the guidance. I made sure that there are various scientific committees and they needed to be brought in to contribute to the guidance. I made sure the right scientific advisory committees were convened, asked the right questions, and that the advice went to the NHS, who could then disseminate it and do it. But I did not do the advice.
And in terms of those other committees needing to consider and decide matters, another issue that's arisen in the evidence before the inquiry is that of delay in terms of the time taken to discuss matters, working through advisory groups, and further discussions before actions can be taken. Do you think that the current system is flexible and speedy enough to make decisions quickly on issues within a pandemic?
What I saw in the flu pandemic, waves 1, 2 and 3, and Ebola and Novichok, yes, we were agile. We responded quickly.
And it may be something you haven't discussed with previous CMOs, but or others. Had that system changed significantly over the years?
It has developed over the years, yes, and I'm sure as we learn the lessons from this pandemic, it'll improve and develop again.
You were CMO when this inquiry was announced. Did you ever consider, whilst you were CMO, running a campaign to try and get those who'd not been identified by the look back to be tested for hepatitis C?
No, and no one suggested it to me. No.
Do you recall discussing anything in that regard with health ministers or your staff?
No, it was not an issue that came up with me.
Did infected blood come up with you at all?
Well, I was aware that there was a cross-party agreement to set up this investigation, and I waited to see how it worked through. I was reclused from those discussions as a haematologist.
And in terms of hepatitis C more generally, was there any consideration given to running a national health campaign in relation to hepatitis C broadly?
Not that I'm aware of, but I might not have been made aware. I didn't know all the policy issues that were going on in the department. I knew about those that I was interested in and worked on, and those where they asked my advice, either on developing the policy or in discussing it with ministers. So plenty went on that I didn't know about, and, you know, I couldn't cover properly all the work of the department, and I didn't set out to.
So those are the questions I have for Professor Davies. I obviously need a little bit of time to establish whether there are further questions from the lawyers behind me. I wonder if we can take a break for, say, I think probably 15 minutes will be ample.
Well, let me deal with it this way. Let me say, not before 22 to 1. Let me just explain. In this inquiry, there are a number of core participants, many of whom are represented by legal representatives. They have a right, through their legal representatives, to invite counsel to ask further questions, and she will. But she has to know what the questions are that they suggest, and they've been listening to you either here in this chamber or online. So we need time for that to happen. And then I can't tell you how long you'll be kept here for answering those questions afterwards. I don't think it'll eat significantly into your lunchtime, but I can't be sure. We'll have to wait and see. But 20 to 1, if you please.
Thank you.